So we're good to go again. I won't reintroduce 5 of our panel members since you've previously met Chris McMaster, Conrad Fernandez, Rob McGuinness, Bob Bell, Marlene Hafner, and Matthew Herder. Joining them to my immediate left is Dr. Alan Beggs, another distinguished member of Ignite's powerful scientific advisory board that we've mentioned a number of times. Just by way of brief introduction, as I did for all the others, Dr. Beggs is the director of the Manton Center for Orphan Disease Research at Boston Children's Hospital and the Sir Edwin and Lady Manton Professor of Pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. He runs a collaborative interdisciplinary research program focused on basic and translational studies of rare diseases, and hence an obvious fit and complement to the talent that you've already met this morning. Purpose of this session was really to build on previous questions that were asked during our 5 presentations, and or to digress and go down some other avenues. There is no formal structure to it. Any and all questions are welcome. Please direct your question to a specific member or to the group as a whole, and we'll see where we land in about 20 minutes time. So who'd like to go first? Karen?
Hi, I'm Karen Bedard. I'm part of the Ignite team. Matthew, I'm wondering about the goal of the litigation. So did the Mayo Clinic think that their product that they had was sufficiently different from the one that was challenged, and were they successful then in getting theirs patented, or did they just sink the whole line of patenting for this type of work?
I'm going to guess. I think they were sued by Prometheus.
Okay.
Initially, so the defense becomes your set of rights is not valid in the first place, and then from there the litigation went. So they were aware of Prometheus's patent, chose not to license it, I believe, which a lot of people do rather than go through very expensive litigation because the risks are so high, and from their point of view, really won out. I don't know if they've tried to file for theirs, but I really doubt it. Unless they were much more narrow.
I'm Andrew Orr. I'd like to ask Bob Bell a question. Bob, in the book, The Emperor of All Maladies, there's a couple of descriptions of drug developments. One was around Herceptin and the other around Gleevec, where it looked like a drug which potentially could have a very large market presence required almost fanatical, perseverance by individual investigators who almost ran sort of skunkworks type projects within their respective pharma. Do you have any thoughts about about whether there are other promising compounds out there that are maybe not being pursued, and ways that we can avoid that kind of a eventuality?
Well, I think the only insight that I could provide is that at the time of the merger with Glaxo and Burroughs Wellcome, there were a lot of really good molecules that, were just stopped going forward. One of those actually was a treatment for primary pulmonary hypertension, which was an orphan disease. And I was able to get that one licensed out. And it's really the backbone of United Therapeutics in Bethesda and RTP. That's just one tangible example of the kind of stuff that gets set aside and lost. And then in large companies, there's always someone that would say, because it's safe, we should keep that. We might find a use for that. Rather than take the risk and see if someone else can extract value for it. I'm sure all of you are aware of the not invented here syndrome within pharma, and no one wants to be wrong about letting something go. But I might mention one prominent member of the Glaxo Wellcome organization that let Zantac, when it expired off a patent, he let that go. So, I mean, one of the things about pharma is it does stuff it's just incomprehensible. As a biochemist from Duke, I knew that was a mistake. But I wasn't doing the commercial side of the business. And so the good news is that pharma gets a lot of it right, but they do make a lot of mistakes. And some of them appear in hindsight to be really, really stupid mistakes.
When I worked at FDA, I thought I understood industry. And then I went to Amgen, and I found out I didn't know a darn thing. It was a very steep learning curve. But among the things I learned was that marketing and commercial have a totally different view from the scientists. And I still am rankled about a drug that has been approved, but that also would treat a very rare disease. They didn't want to bother with it. And nor did they want anyone else to bother with it, because it had some significant side effects and they didn't want to take the risk. So decisions are made for reasons that we don't understand or don't agree with. And I'm sure there can be healthy arguments on both sides.
I've just got a question for everybody up here. Gets me out of answering questions. So with genomics, we're going to be able to stratify patients more and more and more with respect to who could or who could not be treated with a disease. Whereas right now, especially for a lot of the larger diseases, you're saying, okay, this is the first choice drug, and if it doesn't work, then there's a second choice drug, and if it doesn't work, it's a third choice drug. This kind of plays off of what Marlene's thinking. The guys who have the first choice drug give it to everybody, and if it fails in 40%, they're okay. They've given it to 100% for a little while. But as we're going to be able to stratify patients, be able to pick who gets which drug first, that's really going to change part of, I guess, blockbusters, but also a lot of diseases will become more stratified, more orphan-like, I guess. And with that, genetic information, because it will be primarily a lot of times genetic information that will drive this, your companion diagnostic will a lot of times be their genetics. But in the wake of Myriad, how's that going to work? Where you can't actually get money or patent, you know, the fact that this particular gene change will or will not allow you to predict a disease or how a drug works. No.
I can take a stab at that. I mean, that's not really my area, but I think with whole exome and genome sequencing and the ability to archive a patient's genomic sequence, even though we don't completely understand the implications of it, I think that there are a number of institutions now that are starting to collect these data, and over time our understanding of those data will evolve. So I'm not sure that there's going to be a big commercial incentive to it, but I think that in the academic realm, people are trying to develop these approaches, and it'll be more of a decentralized approach. And as specific information becomes available, for example, a new genetic predisposition to something or ability to respond to a drug becomes known, there will be the ability to go in and query somebody's existing data and ask. And it's not going to necessarily be a large, expensive process in the future.
Yeah, one thing that comes to my mind is there are some of the oncology drugs for colon cancer that target the KRAS gene. Now, if the patient has the wild type, the patient will respond. If they have a mutant KRAS, patient won't respond. So your diagnostic that goes along with it is to test for mutant or wild type. It's not to test for whether the patient will or will not respond to the drug.
If I could jump in. So a couple of things. The broader point is that I guess we're assuming in the case of those companion diagnostics that the vehicle will look close to the vehicles we have right now, and I'm not sure that that's going to be an accurate prediction because of these legal changes in patenting, and then also changes in how these technologies are being regulated. Perhaps there's, and I'm not a believer in, let's take open source from software development and think it's going to work in the bio context. I think that's a very fraught transition, and the evidence I've seen is that it often doesn't work. But if we actually, and this might be extremely controversial, but if we regulate some of the laboratory developed tests more, but at the same time impose conditions of openness, right? Because at least in Canada, a lot of the clinical data, validity and so on is not open. It's not out there. It's sat on by people, academics in many cases, not just industry, because they want to protect their competitive edge. And so if there's more openness, perhaps there'll be opportunities to aggregate a lot of research. There was just a big paper that came out in the Public Library of Science Medicine, or maybe just the flagship journal, around the need for access to full data reports for submissions for market authorization, which is hugely controversial. But they're saying that we need this in part for reasons of innovation, because we need to give opportunities for businesses to see where others go wrong in clinical trials. And this is not limited to diagnostics in particular. But maybe there's some opportunity for disruptive innovation. So that's the vehicle. Where are we going with all of this? And not just restricting it to how business proceeds right now. The second point is that even within how business proceeds right now, I'm aware of at least one example in Canada, which might fall flat on its face, but it's doing well, where, and it's just, I know this because a childhood friend basically gave the idea while on a postdoc away to the company without any kind of an agreement, and they're moving forward with it. And he contacted me because he wanted to make sure that he was sort of in the value chain and rewarded in some way. And talked to them in turn about patenting, and they wanted nothing to do with it because it was so hard. And they said, our market advantage is being the first mover. So lots of companies wouldn't make that same judgment and assume that being first mover is enough. And that'll vary depending on the technology, obviously. But in some cases, there are companies that are moving forward in the absence of patents and see other ways to corner the market, at least for a certain period of time, and that's enough. Whether enough of those to scale and to get the kind of therapies that we need, who knows?
Okay. Quick question about sort of some future therapies. I'm quite interested in RNA interference possibilities, and I'm just wondering, there's been a lot of research and papers coming out on that type of drug development / treatment. Just wondering if there's going to be any issues with patenting or commercialization of those types of technologies, in your opinion.
At the start of your question, I thought this is definitely not one for me. Great. I'm not. It seems to me that there could well be. I know there are already a lot of RNA patents, to my knowledge, and microRNA patents that are out there. What in the wake of Prometheus, what that does, none of those patents are suddenly invalidated, right? They're out there in force, but their value and their certainty is uncertain. So anyone who's negotiating or contracting around them is suddenly going into a boardroom thinking that their primary asset value negotiating tool is this IP, and the other side is now going to say your IP is not worth much, or we don't think it is. So those negotiations at best are going to take longer, and at worst, in many cases, won't get done. So it's just really disruptive.
Initially also for Matthew, but anyone else feel free to jump in, which has to do with, Matthew, on one of your slides, you talked about how the Prometheus decision may affect personalized medicine or personalization of medicine, which one could argue the whole IGNITE project is sort of personalized or precision genetic-based medicine. And certainly in oncology, the goal of many sort of research groups and the themes of a number of research meetings that I've been at recently has been more personalized targeted medicine rather than the more sort of generic cytotoxic approaches. that have been used. And so my question is, in the wake of the Prometheus decision, in terms of your thoughts and others on the panel, is this going to create a sea change in terms of both academia and industry in terms of being invested? Because I think up till now many of them have been invested in this trend of more personalized medicine. Is this going to see a sea change, or are people just going to keep pushing that agenda forward because they see that as having benefit?
My initial thought is I don't think the story's over, and bio, et cetera, is going to Congress in very full force to talk about change through law, not through the courts, because of the implications because of how heavily invested in that field of research they are. So I'm not sure that there's no right of appeal beyond the Supreme Court, but if Congress does something, then we might see further change that is back in the other direction. And I wouldn't count that out even sort of a year after Congress passed a major set of amendments to the U.S. patent laws, which was, getting any legislation passed in the U.S. is really, really hard. And so, because it is this big, I think there's going to be an attempt to go through Congress to get changes that respond to the court's decision. And Breyer left it open for that kind of, sort of, we're not sure what the effects of this really are. So if there's enough concern about the effects of this decision, I think there's an argument for legislative change. I'm not sure I support it though, but I think that'll happen. Yeah, that's just my initial thought.
I think part of it too is, can you use some sort of biomarker, whether it's a hunk of DNA, to predict whether a mutation is causal or not, results in you then being able to choose, should this person get this medicine versus this medicine, and at what dose, kind of a thing, is kind of where they're talking. But I don't think it's going to change the fact that you're still going to need a medicine. You're just going to be able to stratify which patients you're going to give it to a little bit better. But then again, there won't be any money in the stratifying of the patients. The money will be in the medicine, I think, might be where things end up.
Yeah, and if I could just, to further expand, I think that the commercial incentive will be more likely on the process of connecting the information, not the information itself, but in terms of not every physician is going to know necessarily all the pharmacogenomics associated with a particular situation, but they'll plug in the clinical presentation and the drug, and there will be informatics companies that will have access potentially to the patient's genetic information that will then put that together and return the information in a form that hopefully would allow the clinician to make an informed decision.
I don't know.
A service, in effect. Sorry.
Am I cue jumping? I just wanted to add one quick thing. So I ended with a slide which said basically biomarkers themselves using a known process or standard probably won't be patentable. I think there's going to be residual importance for a test that's used sometimes in the jurisprudence called machine or transformation. So if you, and the Supreme Court has sort of beat this test down several times despite the fact that lower courts like it a lot. But if biomarker identification and tying it into use with a particular therapy is somehow integrated into a particular machine, and that information is transformed from its natural state. This is all incredibly abstract, I realize, but this is the terms in which the debate is playing out. There's still a role for that kind of end around. That will transform it into an application. There was, just to give you one example from a different field, a case in 1972 called Benson, in which there was a well-known sort of law of nature, a mathematical principle that was integrated into this algorithm and this machine, essentially, that was used to sort of meld rubber together. And the claims, in effect, integrated this law of nature into that, but the court said this is still patentable subject matter. And in Prometheus, it said it's still that good law. It said this is the kind of stuff that gets you over the hump because it's been transformed, it's been integrated into this machine or system. So there's still some room. It's just really hard to predict where that room is.
The question is for Marlene. You mentioned something about developing systems to improve our ability to follow natural history of these orphan diseases and drug development. And I was just wondering, you mentioned it, but how is this being done, and how is this going to affect how we proceed as clinicians in order to get the information we need to know what the drugs that we're developing for will be best suited for which patients. And then going forward too, all these are always going to remain investigational to some degree, because we'll have to monitor side effects, as we won't have big clinical trials to guide us. So I was just wondering how this process was being done, and are we going to see some kind of report that will suggest how we do this best, or?
Well, as usual, the devil's in the details. We all say we need natural history studies, but we don't know exactly what they look like. And there are a variety of pushes going on. There were excellent descriptions, and they're now available on the web, on the NIH website of the Natural History Meeting. But there were excellent descriptions of what a natural history study should include. Because what you really need to do is start looking at patients with whatever this disease is as soon as it's diagnosed. You know, what is the phenotype versus the genotype? What does it look like? What does it look like 5 years hence? Do all patients have the same symptoms? How do they differ? How are they the same? What are the biochemical markers, if there are any, and usually there are somewhere? And looking at all those sorts of things with the hope that down the road, as drugs are developed, you can know better how that drug will or will not work based on the way the drug affects the disease or the portion of the disease. But I can send you to the website. It'll differ from disease to disease. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has been just superb in collecting a natural history. Bob Bell started it 20-some years ago, and they know a lot about cystic fibrosis. But when Genzyme was developing one of their MPS drugs, they had to develop their own natural history so they could say, and here's how the drug works. Right. Sorry, that's not as finite an answer as you would like, I'm sure.
No, I understand it. It's quite the task to do that. I was just thinking in terms of, the natural history studies is all fine and dandy, but there's no funding for that kind of thing in general.
There is no funding, and not only that, what I didn't realize, because I hadn't thought it through, is that if you are a patient participating in a natural history study, these are pretty intensive and invasive issues. It's not just height and weight and how are you feeling today, but it may involve biopsies of various organs. It definitely includes blood draw, which is not all that exciting. But it's all sorts of things that is sometimes difficult to sell.
Yeah. Because I do think it's different than just looking at our charts retrospectively and looking at the natural history backwards. And so I was wondering what those guidelines were, and if there was something somewhere that was decided by a body of sorts. And
there's no guidance per se. And NIH is looking at some money.
It's not really a question, but just a little bit to add to that, that in the Children's Hospital in Toronto, there's somebody who's doing some work at developing like kind of a point-and-click phenotyping. It reminds me a little bit of the mouse database system where they sort of have all kinds of clinical information about the patients that you can kind of point and click and have keywords so that all of the data ends up being collected and becomes searchable after the fact, so that people aren't sort of using handwritten notes that you can't search for after the fact, or describing the same clinical description using different adjectives and descriptions. there's space to upload photos, and there's, okay. Well, yeah, I maybe that didn't add to it at all, but I guess I thought that the sort of systematic would help in sort of, I don't know if it's a guideline so much, but at least it's a uniformity of the data collection. So.
We ran a little overtime, so we appreciate you staying. The group had asked me to try and sum things up, and given the breadth of the territory we covered, that's a little tricky. But I'll give it a quick shot, just in terms of a few things that stuck with me and hopefully resonated with you as well. I guess kicking off with Conrad and Chris, continue to be impressed, as I'm sure you are, with the seamless integration of the Ignite project and their genuine ability to go from bedside to bench and back, even though that's a term that is overused by many groups. And it certainly did an effective job at highlighting the ethical and policy issues associated with the return of genomic research results. In Bob's presentation that took us from 5,000 to 10,000 new chemical entities, with only one coming out the other end of the pipe after 10 to 15 years and upwards of $1 billion, was a very effective summary at how narrow that funnel is. And hence, in the context of orphan diseases, the business case there is certainly much more challenging, even though Marlene pointed out that the incidence numbers in terms of the definition of orphan diseases are often constructed around being surrogates for profitability, to use her terms. Yet, with the evolution of orphan drug policy and the incentives that are put in place, as many have pointed out, the traction and the interest in the orphan drug space continues to rise, while trying to balance through those incentives the tightrope, as someone put, between rapid access and ensuring safety. And I think Marlene's comment was that the appetite is to the point where some are reporting upwards of $6 billion in sales. Whether or not that number is accurate, I don't know. We learned from Matthew's presentation regarding the Prometheus case and the significant implications that it holds, both in the long term and the short term. And a couple of specific things were stuck with me, and hopefully I've captured these correctly, Matthew, because I'm not a lawyer. But one of your points was that if currently overclaiming is a concern, that the Prometheus case may introduce, I think as you put it, modesty in patent drafting, while reaffirming the patentability of repurposed drugs, which of course is very important to the Ignite project, and may have implications in the context of the Myriad case as well. If you put it all together, really, it all comes down to, in its simplest terms, leveraging the power of gene discovery in the context of bringing both societal and personal level at the individual patient level. And certainly Rod's presentation about the, as he put it, the genetic vulnerability of photoreceptors in the eye and the exponential decline of some of those associated cells, and the kinetics of that decline indicates that early intervention is absolutely critical, and hence the translation of the knowledge that comes out of the project in the context of intervention needs to be as expeditious as possible. The Ignite project will no doubt help us understand an array of diseases at a much deeper level, and hopefully will create associated translational efforts that are both exciting and doable, yet recognizing at the same time that we can't ever get away from the potential complicators, if you will, in the context of regulatory, legal, and financial issues. So just in terms of a real couple of quick thank yous, an excellent session. Thank you to all of our speakers and panel members, to the leadership of the Ignite team for pulling the session today together. I'd also like to extend a specific thank you to Sue Quillen and Nate Stepner who pulled together the overall event, and it may seem simple, but they made it seamless and seem simple because of all their efforts leading up to today. I know I learned a lot. I hope you learned something. For those that accrued some CME credits, that's an additional bonus. As a last reminder, your evaluation forms are both needed and welcome. The certificates will be waiting for you. Thank you again, everyone, for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the day.